All right. Good morning, comrades. This is WHIV New Orleans 102.3. Good morning, comrade. You can also get us on our twitch.tv/ Good Morning Comrade Radio. Jeff on the show. We have a very special guest, returning champion. This is what, your fourth or fifth time on here?
Yeah.
The one and only Ben Burgis. Ben, what's going on? You're now at Morehouse College in Georgia?
Yep. This is on a very short list of things that me and Martin Luther King have in common, but we've both taught a philosophy class at Morehouse College.
That's definitely going on the resume, right?
What is that? What's the beer?
I got Shinerbach. It's a classic Texas beer. I mean, your wife's from Texas, right?
She is, yeah. She grew up in suburban Dallas, and then when she was starting high school, her parents moved down to way down in the tip of South Texas where they still live now. But she also lived in Houston for a while in her 20s, so she's been around the state.
Yeah, my aunt used to live in Houston. I think she still currently lives in Houston, but for a while, she and her husband at the time, he's passed now, but
Yeah.
they had a ranch, I guess,
Yeah.
in Shiner, Texas, where that beer is brewed,
Yeah.
which is like a 2,000 person town. It's like one of those towns. And you ever hear those stories about somebody the kind of old crazy guy who's got a barn full of old cars that are worth so much money?
Mm-hmm.
This dude had Model Ts, Model As, all kinds of crazy stuff in his barn. All these old Ford and Chevy trucks, which is what happened to those trucks?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, this is the least original thing ever. Everybody always says this, but I got to go to conference in Cuba 9 years ago, and that's the thing that immediately hits every American
Oh,
whoever goes to that place. It's just this constant parade of classic American cars, everywhere.
best mechanics in the world live in Cuba, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. They should supplement the program where they send doctors around with mechanics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, I mean, the problem now, I guess, with that is that cars are just not built to be repaired in any way
Yeah.
any longer. It's just that cars are just I mean, you've seen and you've heard about the especially farm equipment like tractors and things that have locks on replacement.
Yes.
That'll have a horn, honk a horn or something if you replace the parts with something that's not proprietary. It's wild. Anyway, you didn't come here to talk about any of this stuff.
No.
You came to talk a little bit about this brand new book that you have out. So the book is called Christopher Hitchens: What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters. So I guess for the benefit of our audience, can you just give us a broad sort of
Yeah.
introduction to who is Christopher Hitchens? Why is he important? Why what inspired you to even your attention to that you wanted to write a book about it? Because I mean, go ahead.
Yeah. So, all right. So Christopher Hitchens is this British left-wing journalist who uh, started in the early '80s, lived in the United States, and he wrote for many years for The Nation magazine. For about 20 years, he was a columnist for The Nation, and he also also other places, but that was kind of the main thing for a long time. He
Felt like his home.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I mean, the same way I always think of, this Jacobin as my home as a writer, although Christopher Hitchens' home certainly paid a hell of a lot better, I'm sure, than that did. But
You hear that, Bhaskar?
but but yeah. Um and he's somebody who, for most of his life, I think the thing that probably occupied the biggest chunk of his attention, at least insofar as writing about politics, a lot of people who are familiar with his political writing aren't really aware he also had, in a way, kind of this whole other career almost as a literary critic, but But insofar as he's writing about politics, I think the thing that probably took up most of his time, the biggest part of his time at least, was foreign policy, and particularly, he was really concerned with things like, in the 80s, kind of U.S. backed, dictatorships and death squads in Central America, um, and Henry Kissinger. Like, he was obsessed with Henry Kissinger, and how much he hated him. And
which is a correct person to hate, right?
yeah. If you're, I mean, this is that
If
is
you're
that.
picking, if you're picking a list of people that are like super villains that are in the like Hall of Injustice with like Lex Luthor, like Henry Kissinger's right up there.
Yeah, no question, no question. That is a very correct person to hate. And Hitchens was a big hater, So in the '90s, where, even though in a way that was kind of a transitional period in terms of his politics, ways we could talk about, but like, probably the work he was best known for in the '90s was this sort of, informal trilogy of books about three of the objects that hate, right? So, Henry Kissinger, Bill Clinton, and then the one that doesn't sound like it's going to fit, which is Mother Teresa. Uh, you think like, oh my God, who would hate Mother Teresa, right? Because, like, all right, Kissinger, like, I think, even like, I'm sure even if you're some like hardened, like, dead-eyed, like, Washington D.C. creature who doesn't hate Henry Kissinger, like, you at least like kind of get that he's like a figure that would inspire a lot of hatred, right? Like, that's probably not mysterious to you.
Right. You
But,
can understand why somebody like that would have haters, even if they're wrong. Like if you don't have any sense of morality, like
yeah.
you can see why the things that Henry Kissinger did over his like you know, bombing Laos is pretty provocative. For example, like
Yeah,
as for one example.
yeah, definitely. And like, in the in the bombing of Cambodia, during the Vietnam War, which was and invasion, that like, which, I mean, Americans often refer to as like the secret, bombing of Cambodia. I don't think it was very secret for Cambodians, but
I
is
noticed.
yeah. Also wasn't particularly secret to people in the American military, right? But like, what that mostly meant was that it wasn't discussed with, with Americans at home. Uh, but that was like Henry Kissinger as the Secretary of Defense of State, and also the head of the National Security Council. Had both hats, was actually like personally overseeing, like the bombing list. Like, famously, Nixon told Kissinger, and Kissinger told them, anything that flies and anything that moves. Um, yeah, really brutal war crimes. And like, another thing that Hitchens gets into in the Kissinger book is um, is Kissinger's involvement in overthrowing Salvador Allende in Chile, which, on the off chance that anybody who listens to Good Morning Comrade isn't familiar with that, I suspect most people are. But like, just real quick, right? I
The
mean,
real
that
9/11.
yeah, no, exactly. September 11th, 1973, and yeah, with much worse consequence, in some ways, right? I mean, like, um, but yeah, and like, to the point that, like, since there was this democratically elected, Democratic Socialist president, Salvador Allende, about whom Kissinger notoriously said that, I don't see why Chile should be allowed to go communist simply because its voters are irresponsible. Like, and in the sort of effort to get rid of this guy, which he was very intimately personally involved in, like, some of the stuff that Hitchens gets into in the Kissinger book are like, there was like all this elaborate plotting to take out. I guess they never exactly said kill in the documents, but like, I don't know where they were going to keep him, right? The this Chilean general who wasn't even a leftist, but it was just like somebody that they knew like wouldn't go along,
Right.
with deposing the elected president. So it's really brutal stuff. So like, Kissinger makes sense. Clinton, I think at the time that was probably a little bit more eccentric to like hate Clinton as much as Hitchens did from the left.
I mean, he was
Uh,
right though. I mean, he was
no,
100%
it's totally
correct.
right. Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a book that No One Left to Lie To is the name of the Clinton book, and that like really gets into like the Dickensian horrors of like welfare reform in the 90s, what that actually meant in practice. And he actually has got like a good passage in there where where he's talking about how when Hillary Clinton was overseeing healthcare reform, and in 1993, when it was famously didn't go through, right? Like people tend to be a little hazy about how they remember exactly what was being suggested there. And Hitchens has a good line about how like she just completely dismissed any thought of single payer. They had like the Physicians for a National Health Plan in the White House, and there's like here plan, all the stuff it would do, look at how it polls, and she told the guy, yeah, tell me something interesting, and her um and like her plan, which was basically Obamacare 1.0. Hitchens has a good line about how it combines the worst of bureaucracy with the worst of free enterprise, which is
Yeah.
very correct.
And
So
just to put
yeah,
like a point on that
yeah,
really quickly, like that's one
yeah,
of these sorts of things where you're going into the insurance company, you're saying like y'all might need to make a haircut, but we're gonna make it as like easy as we can for you. We're gonna try and cut a
uh,
deal essentially here,
yeah,
and then she would frame that in her political career. And she did this for decades after, even in a run for president, that she stood up to the
yes.
insurance companies, and she stood up to these like these big bad monsters, but that she was able to fight them as though like she as though she was actually doing that, which obviously wasn't the case. She was like trying to say, okay, look, we need to like reel in what you're doing a little bit, because you're jumping into Scrooge McDuck bins of money and swimming in it is just like bad luck.
Yeah, totally. And honestly, I think the biggest insurance companies were on board,
Hmm.
at the time. I mean, there were like famous like ads that ran denouncing it or whatever, but I think that was like the smaller ones who thought they wouldn't be able to, afford it as well, who were mostly opposed to it, which was actually pretty much the pattern when Obamacare came about also.
20
That
years later.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly, right. That like the really giant insurance companies were like pretty much in the room when it was being designed. Uh, so yeah, so okay, like Kissinger, everybody can kind of see that one. Clinton, if you're a leftist in 2022, I think you'll pretty much recognize, oh yeah, he was totally right about that. Like if you're writing for the Nation in the 90s, like it was unusual to be that harsh about the Clintons, but Mother Teresa is the one where like her name is almost synonymous with like saintly self-sacrifice, right? Like that's how people still use it now. And it's a really interesting book because if people know like anybody who's like watching, listening to this, um who knows like one thing about Christopher Hitchens, right? The one thing that they probably know is his like prominence as an atheist in the late 2000s. Like that's the if you have like one data point, that's going to be it, right?
Yeah.
If you have two, it'll be that and the bad foreign policy positions from the same era. We'll certainly get into that, but if you have one, that's going to be it. And so, given that, you would think that you would think that like, all right, he wrote a book about Mother Teresa. It's going to be this like super atheisty, like kind of anti-religious book. It's actually kind of surprising the extent to which it's not. That like he goes after her a little bit about her support for what he calls the fundamentalist faction within the Vatican and on issues like, contraception and ordaining women. But like that's the critique that like a liberal Catholic would make, right? Like, and he,
Yeah, no, that is a literal like
uh,
I grew up like laps I grew up lapsed
yeah,
Catholic.
yeah.
That's like that is the position. That is exactly that position.
Yeah, yeah, totally, right? And he and there's like one passage where he kind of like makes fun of this British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge for like being super credulous about this miracle that he thought he witnessed in Mother Teresa's hospice in Calcutta. that he said that Muggeridge said that they took these photos and and it was like bathed in this mysterious divine light, even though the lighting conditions were bad in there. And there's this very funny passage where he basically like he actually talks to the photographer who took the photos. It's like, yeah, I mean, there's the like sure, they came out better than we thought they would, but I mean, like that's like this new film stock we got. I mean, that's goes to the greater glory of Kodak. Uh, but but like that's kind of it, right? For the like actual religious component of the book. Like really, his complaint about Mother Teresa is that she's hanging out with and kind of lending her aura of moral credibility to like the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti. That she's on like really chummy terms with with people like Charles Keating. That she has uh, that she's like raising all of this money, which like people think, even though she never exactly says it, right? But people assume is like actually going to like materially helping, desperate people in Calcutta. That is actually, seems to be mostly spent on like religious missionary work. And in fact, like at those hospices, that is not really where you want to end up if you have the alternative of a real hospital, because she seems to have had these like views that like suffering was good for the soul, and and it's the details are pretty grim.
Twisted stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So like those are the kind of books.
Which, by the way, sounds, dare I say, Protestant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It totally does, actually. That's very true. Um, yeah, which yeah, yeah, no, that's funny actually. I like that. But so yeah, that's the stuff that he was writing in the 90s. And then the big like, from our perspective, the big heel turn we usually think of as coming with his reaction to 9/11. Although one of the stories I'm trying to tell in the book is that I think like what exactly happened there was a little bit more complicated, but started earlier. And I really wanted to get into that, right? But like
Let's get into that. Let me just pause to
uh,
look at
uh,
station ID. You're listening to WHIV New Orleans 102.3. It's Gilmer Comrade. We have Ben Burgis on the show. We are talking about his book, Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters. He just mentioned so I like how you portrayed that too as a heel turn. Are you a wrestling fan? Because I sure am. But essentially there was a sort of a, what is at
uh,
least portrayed as
uh,
a change in how Hitchens tended to view things, I guess you could say, or there was definitely like a noticeable change in trajectory for him. Can you talk a little bit about that? You were about to get into that.
yeah. So this is I mean, in a way, this gets back to the first thing you asked me, right? Like, kind of why this is something I was interested in, and why I want to write about him. And to my mind, there are basically three reasons, right? So, one, I think, um, I was, I used to watch more wrestling, like it's been a very long time, but I did watch a lot of it, like as a kid. But was, watched.
When you come down, we should watch some AEW or something.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, no, I used to, yeah, Saturday mornings were at the piano teacher's house while my sister was having her lesson before I had mine. I used to watch WWE back when it was called WWF. So, but
anyway,
uh,
digression.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So like, so one reason is before that heel turn, I think that he produced like a lot, like this big body of work that I think is good work that I think deserves to be recovered and people should know about, and people get something out of engaging with. And I kind of wanted to introduce an audience of young socialists who, if they know who this guy is at all, it's like only the late 2000s incarnation. Wanted to kind of rehabilitate some of that earlier work. So that's one thing.
Mhm.
But then another is that I wanted to figure out exactly how he took from my perspective, such a like disastrous and indefensible wrong turn in
Mhm.
those foreign policy positions.
So
Like,
can you talk about a little bit what the foreign policy positions were?
yeah,
The
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So after after 9/11, like not very long after, some of his like very earliest stuff after it is a little bit more ambiguous, but like not very long after, he kind of decided that this was, I mean, he in one of the cringiest comments, right, like he says that this is like a this this moment where like everything he loves, like secularism and like kind of the empowerment of women and like a sort of open society, all that stuff was coming into conflict with everything that he hated, which the sort of repressive religious et cetera stuff that was represented by Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and so he became a strong supporter of these post 9/11 wars in the Middle East. So the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, and he never he died in 2011, and he never really let go of that, right? Like he never really acknowledged like I was horribly wrong, that this stuff was a disaster as anybody should have been able to predict at the at the time, right? He'd refer to this stuff as like the liberation of Afghanistan, the liberation of Iraq. So that's the kind of starting point if you think about that wrong turn. And I think a lot of people who like on the left who are somewhat familiar with his earlier work and then kind of know about that, um, sort of assume that this is just this like kind of turn on a dime, like kind of immediate reversal, right?
Mm.
That like, one day he's like a good anti-imperialist, and then like the next day he's like advocated the invasion of Iraq, and it's like, what the hell happened? Like an extreme version of this.
Like an actual heel turn in wrestling, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
actually throwing like American leftists through a barbershop window kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He's on there with the chair, that's the yeah. Yeah. So um so like there's a like Tariq Ali, who was uh a friend of uh who was a friend of Hitchens at one point, and um gets a positive shout out in Hitchens's memoir, Hitch 22, where he's explaining why he likes the Stones better than the Beatles, and he says, and he mentions, the sort of comparison of Revolution Number 9 with Street Fighting Man, which he says, the Jagger wrote about, my friend Tariq Ali, as the inspiration. Um, so Tariq Ali has this book called Bush in Babylon, which is his book about the Iraq War, where he's got this appendix where he says, he describes how his friend Christopher Hitchens tragically died on 9/11 and was replaced with this hideous neoconservative replicant, and like that's the, you know so that's kind of the image I think a lot of people on the left who are more familiar with like earlier Hitchens have of what happened there. And so I think you get a lot of people sort of explaining explaining it in ways that never really made that much sense to me, that like even though I mean, like I shared their disgust with like where he ended up, like their explanations of how he got there never really resonated with me. It didn't sound right. Like they'd say like, oh, this is like just purely an opportunist thing, is he just like, he just took the money basically, right? Or else, there are people who, like there are people who sort of do this weird thing where they try to blame the drinking, that there's like this, like that's like somehow like this is like a side effect of like liver disease or something that it like makes you support imperialist wars, which
Yeah.
like
This physical condition has a psychological or something manifestation or whatever. Completely ridiculous.
yeah, no, it is completely ridiculous. Like especially because look, um, you know, as somebody who as somebody who does drink a fair amount and I'll admit that like in the late 2000s, when I had very ambivalent feelings about Christopher Hitchens, that was always something that I enjoyed about him. That he'd have like he'd go out onto like the Bill Maher show or whatever, and he'd just like have this like glass of scotch that
Yeah.
he just like bring out with him, which is like everybody else who's a guest on a talk show just like discreetly like pour some booze into their coffee cup or something. It's just like sitting there with the
Well,
glass.
it's part of the optics here.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. Like I remember back in like was it like 2010 or something, my friend Mark, for Halloween, he dressed as vampire Christopher Hitchens. So it was like a sports jacket and like a glass of whiskey and some vampire fangs, uh, but but like don't get me wrong, I do think like clearly he drank more than he should have, and it does seem to have been a factor in his early death, because the esophageal cancer. But I think if you watch any of those debates, like there are a million of these on YouTube, right? These debates that he did in the last few years of his life, no matter how much you agree or disagree with anything that he's saying, I don't think you could deny that he was like extremely sharp to the bitter end.
Mhm.
So I don't think that it's just like he drank too much Johnny Walker Black and it ate his brain or whatever. I think there's something else going on here, and I'm also not. I also think the way that he changes politics, I think, doesn't really track the sort of oh he just took the money kind of explanation because um like there's an essay by Norman Finkelstein where he like has like it's basically the oh he just took the money explanation of Christopher Hitchens, but he's doing it sort of in the context of talking about this sort of broader category of left apostates. And you read that thing and it's like, well, what he's describing doesn't actually fit very well with Hitchens, because he's talking about people who will like denounce all of their previous beliefs and association, say, "Oh, I was so wrong about everything," whatever. That's kind of the opposite.
He never wrote a "Why I Left the Left" like Dave Rubin or something.
No, no, not at all, right? I mean, like he died in 2011, and so like Hitch 22, that memoir, which was published in 2010, so like 9 years after 9/11, he's like extremely nostalgic about about his experiences as like a young Trotskyist in the UK. He really like defends a lot of the positions that he'd always taken, and like honestly, he's like pretty thought like he doesn't reflect on it that much,
Mhm.
right? But like and to the extent, and when I say reflects on, I should say, right, that there's a passage where I say that in the book that like there's one reviewer who like really jumped on and be like, oh, but there are these other 10 things that he said about it. It's like, yeah, what I mean is like he doesn't say very much in terms of sort of directly explaining, right, his
Right.
his his shifts on some of this stuff. But what he does is actually like reads is pretty thoughtful to me, like somebody who's like in a way where if anything, I mean, his rhetorical strategy later in life was always to emphasize the continuities between the things he used to believe and the things that he believed now. I think it reads to me like sort of good faith grappling with like, okay, what did I think then? And why is it that this stops seeming, right to me?
Mhm.
And um and especially like it's also kind of weird because it's like, I don't know. I mean, if you were just going to do the Dave Rubin thing in the 2000s, like how would you do it, right? I mean, well, what was the if you really wanted to be like totally embraced by the American right as it existed in the 2000s? I mean, like if you remember the 2000s, uh, being an outspoken militant atheist was not the way into the hearts of
No,
conservatives in the
absolutely
2000s.
not.
Like, so I don't think that's it, right? I think something else is going on. So, and I should also say, right, like one of the not as ridiculous as the explanations we've been talking about, but like one of the other explanations people give is, oh, it was actually because of the atheism that like made him like really Islamophobic, and that's what did it. And like unlike the other ones, I think there's probably some truth there. Like I think there are some things you could say in fleshing that out that aren't totally wrong. I certainly think that he tended to essentialize Islam, but meaning like he tended to um, be too sort of broad about lumping together, different kinds of, of Islamic beliefs. To be fair, he definitely did the same thing when he talked about Christianity, right?
Yeah.
But like but he did.
Unlike Sam Harris, for example, who will basically like do the like Islam is bad and Christianity is good, but I'm an atheist. I'm just which like it is something that like pings in my brain when the atheism question comes up, or like when they have that kind of association, and then like the Islamophobia, you know,
Yeah,
thing or
yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
and like you can at least say that Hitchens compared to people like like Sam Harris
Uh,
are at least equal in their disdain for religion as
yeah,
a
yeah. Yeah,
as opposed to the like laser like concentration on Islam by somebody like Sam Harris.
yeah, I think that's totally right. In fact, I think that like I think in a way, like if you read Hitchens's atheist book, God is Not Great.
And it's not
Uh
to excuse anything, by the
no,
way,
no,
not to
no,
excuse
totally,
any
totally,
that's
right. But
making a distinction here.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you could agree that his actual positions and some of the stuff were awful, but like, just think like, just be analytic about it. Like, is that it? Well, no, I don't think it is because, if anything, like if you read that book, honestly, I think he's more focused on Christianity, right? I mean, like that's really because that's what he spent like most of his life thinking about, right? That like that's like the sort of immediate thing. Like that's I mean, in fact, he has this kind of funny line in a couple places about how um he he sort of thinks of himself as a Protestant atheist, because like there's like the Church of England is like that's what he originally, he started out disbelieving in that, right? They,
I can deal with the atheist part, but not the Protestant part.
yeah, 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 yeah. Which is funny because so Christopher Hitchens, I should say, for anybody who's not familiar with this fact about him, has a brother who's still alive, Peter Hitchens, and in some ways it's like bizarre and hilarious. These guys are brothers, right? That they because Peter Hitchens is extremely religious, just to begin with, right? And there's a line in Hitch 22 where he says that I could imagine he says the Protestant atheist thing again, and he says I could imagine Peter as an atheist, but not as a Catholic. Uh,
That's awesome. You know, so just to kind of like get
yeah,
into
yeah,
conversation land just a little bit in this,
yeah,
so I
yeah.
cannot help myself
Sure,
sometimes.
sure.
But so considering the fact that his brother was religious,
Uh,
could that be like a justification or a reasoning at least behind why he might dig his heels in on the atheism thing, because he wants to like because like he's got a spat with his brother on this specific thing and it just makes that public. Like I don't know if you have any siblings or anything. Like I could definitely see who's who's the host who's one of the hosts on this show, like me and him just like memeing about that kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah. 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 I have yeah, I actually have an older sister and a younger brother. And happily I don't really have any feuds with either of them, but but I can sort of imagine, right, that if I did, right, that would probably be the most intense like thing of my life because
There's
like
nothing there's nothing that's more intense in the world that never ever abates than like sibling rivalry. It just always is present in everything.
Yeah, and so yeah, there might be something there psychologically. Actually,
Not to get too, not to
no,
get.
no, 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 sure, sure, but I could imagine that, like, I'd not being the reason, but like adding a
Yeah.
little extra intensity to it. That there's a like I actually interviewed Peter, and he told me that he thought that like the militant atheism was the most consistent position that Christopher had held throughout his life. He said probably from about the age of 11. So,
Wow.
but I don't know if that's correct or not. But this the story he tells, the story that Christopher tells in God is not great. A couple of places I think is that he had, he was at like whatever. I guess this was probably boarding school already. He had, um, that's there's a, his family was kind of like upwardly mobile middle class. His dad was a naval officer, and he claims to have like as like a really little kid to have like overheard this argument between his parents about whether they could afford to send him to boarding school, and his mother saying, if this country is going to have a ruling class, I want Christopher to be part of it. So, but um,
That's,
but
I mean, like that is not like like their parents are not the only like people in that position that would think that exact same thing.
totally, yeah, yeah. No,
Thing.
I'm sure it's a very common,
Yeah.
yeah. Um,
Let's just pause for station ID. You're listening to BHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. We got Ben Burgis. We're talking about Christopher Hitchens. He has a brand new book out on this character. What he got right, how he went wrong, and why he still matters. Christopher Hitchens by Ben Burgis.
yeah,
But anyway, I'm sorry, you were making a point.
yeah, yeah. I should say, by the way, that the second part of that subtitle, uh, there's a reason it's what he got right and how he went wrong, because
Okay.
and this is something that like some um like one of the sort of um groups of people who dislike the book, or like the sort of unreconstructed like late Hitchens fans, who are like, oh, you're just like assuming that like the Iraq war was bad. It's like, yeah, no, I am, right. Like I'm not really that interested in like, I mean, I kind of spent a couple pages on it, but like I kind of think that if in 2022 you need to be like convinced that the Iraq
We ain't litigating this. Like we're just not doing that.
like you're probably beyond hope, like so I think the how was much more interesting than what he got wrong. But
So how did he go wrong?
yeah, yeah. So I was just gonna say, by the way, on the atheism thing, that he,
Oh, I think Harden.
so the story he tells is he was in, he had like a, was it like his like Bible teacher and nature teacher, were the same, like it was the same person who was supposed to teach those two things, and they were like out in the field or something. And she said, like, he was like a kid. And, she said something about how, oh, isn't it wonderful that God created this, nature, all being like green, because he knew this was like the color that was most pleasing to our eyes. And he claims that like even as a kid, like, he never heard of Darwin or anything like that, right? But like something kind of snapped. He was like, wait a second, that's got to be the other way around, right? Like like this is, like that it must be that like our eyes are attuned to like appreciate that color, because like, anyway. But yeah, so what do I think happened, right? So I think that one other reason I don't find the Islamophobia explanation fully convincing, right? Even though certainly we talked about the essentialism issue, and certainly I think at the very least you could say he wildly overestimated the realistic threat that like Al Qaeda style terrorism could pose to Western societies. Not exactly a unique Christopher Hitchens problem in the 2000s, but
That was literally like every single like person that you talked to said we're under attack, at all times. We must like I think people do forget the tenor. Like I mean, I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and like the years that followed after that, I'd never thought I would see such normal people like so bloodthirsty, and the U.S. media, all like literally just like fanning those flames as hard as they possibly could, and like not to be like a like media like whatever or whatever, Like, but that's just like that is literally what the feeling was, what the sense of that period of time was. Again, not to excuse anything. However, like that is not a unique, that is a not a novelty position for
No, no,
for,
that
for
was that was just kind of the air in
norm.
the 2000s. And yeah, and by the way, I mean, like, I don't want to get too deep off into this digression, but like, I recently saw there was like a debate last year uh, between Bill Kristol, who's a big neocon, and
Ooh.
yeah, yeah, and Scott Horton, who's like kind of a weird libertarian, but is definitely the good guy in this debate. And one of the points that I love that Horton made is that like Crystal, who like a lot of people like him, sort of uh, you know became like kind of a never Trump kind of Republican, and sort of drifted into like MSNBC land. And Horton points out, it's like, look, I mean, you wouldn't have Trump if not for all this, right? I mean, like you guys spent the 2000s fanning these flames and like and like promoting like every like just the most like depraved shit imaginable on like right wing talk radio, like like whip people up into this like nationalistic frenzy, when you thought it was going to like promote your political projects, and like now you don't like what you created, right? Like this is but like let's not forget that you guys did this.
Real Mary Shelley's Frankenstein type situation, right?
Yeah, yeah, totally. So yeah, so again, like if you want to call that like sort of exaggerating what was a exaggerating Al Qaeda style terrorism into this kind of like existential threat that it really was. If you call that Islamophobia, I certainly won't fight you on it. But I think that one reason I don't think that Islamophobia is a main determinant of what happened with Hitchens, and I think also something that starts to explain what did happen, is that the first war where he really starts to warm up to the idea that the US military could be a force for good in the world is not actually one where the United States is bombing Muslims. It's the war in Bosnia in the 90s, where the United States is actually intervening on behalf of Muslims against Serbian Orthodox Christians.
Mhm.
Um, and and then like the second one was like Kosovo, right? Same deal. So I think what did happen, I think there are basically two strands that you have to connect there, and one of them is like the sort of foreign policy strand, and the other one is the socialism strand. So I think like the foreign policy strand, I think that started in the 90s, right? Even though most of the stuff that he was producing in the 90s, right? Certainly the books that he was writing in the 90s, we're still, very left wing, like the ones we talked about earlier. They're still very, his like predominant attitude towards like, the American role in the world was still very critical. Like in, he wrote this book and came out in 1996 called Blood, Class, and Empire, uh, where he talks about how, or I don't know, I don't remember if he uses this line in the book itself, but he certainly says this in interviews about it, that like he's talking about the Anglo-American relationship there, and it says he hates what Anglophile means in the U.S. and what pro-American means in Britain, right? That if in the U.S. Anglophile means that you like the monarchy and country houses and masterpiece theater and all that shit,
Right.
and in England pro-American means what does he say? Thinking wanting our boys at MI5 to be the best friends with the lads at Langley. Uh, and he says it would be so much healthier if being an Anglophile meant that you liked the NHS, and being pro-American meant that you wanted the UK to copy the Freedom of Information Act and the separation of church and state. So,
Free speech laws too in the UK
yeah, 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 totally. Uh, and so even though that was like the kind of main tone of like most of the stuff that he was writing when he wasn't writing about Yugoslavia in the 90s, uh, I think you get in the 90s the beginning of one big part of this transition, which is that I think his perception of things, right? Like, I think what he was most bothered by about American foreign policy, like in the 70s and the 80s, was that we were backing these like fascists in Central America and and other places like that. And so I think like if George W. Bush was like fighting wars in the 2000s, uh, yeah, against against like peasant revolutionaries like the Viet Cong, I don't think that Hitchens ever would have like talked himself into supporting that. But I think that his perception starting in the 90s was that in a post Cold War world, like things were really starting to change and like the kind of old patterns didn't really apply. It seemed to him that like the kinds of enemies that the United States was fighting weren't like you know the Viet Cong or the Sandinistas. They were like uh, these like very fascisty, death squatty kinds of forces in Serbia, or they were this like brutal right wing dictatorship in Iraq, or they were the Taliban, and that these are exactly the kinds of like in other words exactly the kind of forces that the American empire used to back up, right? Were
Which,
ones
which, by the way, like the
that
fault in that line of thinking becomes that that U.S. intervention or something can make that situation better.
right,
That's
right,
that's sort of the fault in that line of thinking. But the analysis
totally,
at least on the front end, like I don't like the Taliban, like,
sure.
like straight up. But I don't think there's anything that U.S. bombs could do to solve that problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. No,
I don't like
exactly.
that like Vladimir Putin wants to just annex Ukraine again, but like what is the US going to do about it? Like nuke them, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like that's and that like really is the thing that I think um, you know, I mean, I think is like really proved by like the last 20 years, which is that I mean, it's like, in some ways, even though in some ways, in terms of the global effects, like the Iraq war was way worse, like in some ways, like just most dramatically,
Mhm.
Afghanistan, right? Because as much as like in some ways the actual like regime that was being deposed like could not be more evil, right? It was awful. But I think one thing that those 20 years of occupation in Afghanistan really showed is that forget the morality of it. I mean, the United States just does not have the capacity to remake that society in our image. That's just not happening. That like 20 years of like fighting and violence and like pouring like ungodly amounts of money into that war, and we couldn't create like a local client state that could like stay in power for 5 seconds after the United States left, right? Which I think really shows it's not. I mean, obviously, I would like there to be social progress and revolution and all of that stuff in Afghanistan, but I just don't think it could happen that way. I think it has to come from inside that society, or else it's just not going to stick.
Mhm.
Um, but but yeah, so I think that's so okay. So I think that's the foreign policy strand, and
Mhm.
then I think the other strand is the socialism strand. So back in the 7 days, he was I don't know if anybody remembers. Actually, I think it no longer exists, but like the ISO in the US is this socialist group that existed until relatively recently.
Mhm.
He was a like back when he was at Oxford, he was a member of the original version of it, which was the British group, the International Socialists, and these are uh, people like if we really wanted to get into the sort of like um, archaeology of like left sectarianism a little bit. This is like a little bit imprecise, but I think that's good enough for now, right? We could just say Trotskyists, like, and leave it at that, um, but like their analysis was that what existed in the Soviet Union uh, wasn't really this like alternative to capitalism. It was really just this sort of like mutant version of it where like the state was like kind of collectively played the role of like a capitalist corporation, but like workers didn't have any more power than they did in the West. and their slogan was, neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism. And so, like, young Hitchens was very involved, in anti-Vietnam War protests, but like also in 1968 when there was these in France, there was like a general strike and like student uprising that like almost like brought down the De Gaulle government. And at the same time, there was the Prague Spring going on, and the in Eastern Europe, where the like a reformist communist government in Czechoslovakia, was trying to create what they called socialism with a human face, was crushed by Soviet tanks. And these things kind of happening at the same time sort of, gave him the impression that there's this kind of global wave of like, of revolt that, that could really lead to something better, East and West. And then by the early 70s, he's just decided that no, that it's not happening, right? That like by the mid 70s, certainly, right? That's like, look, I've been devoting my life to this group, but like I think 1968 wasn't really the beginning of something. It was at least the end of it for now, right? And
Yeah. Which, by the way, by some definition, is when somebody might define the moment that they become old.
yeah,
You know, I'm feeling that. I'm feeling that myself right now. So I'm just sort of like,
yeah, totally. Uh,
I,
I was
I
look,
get.
look, Jeff, I was just you know I've been watching Community with Jennifer, and like and like I'm feeling like full on old man nostalgia watching it. I was like, oh man, 2009, that was nice. Uh,
That was. It seemed like a much simpler time, didn't it?
it did totally, but
Anyway, I'm sorry. I did not mean to interrupt.
yeah. Well, anyway, I was just gonna say, I think that in so so he leaves the kind of world of like, kind of tiny revolutionary socialist, organizations by the mid 70s. But in some ways, even though I think for most of his career he's like a much more moderate kind of socialist, he he rejoins the Labor Party after that, and and he doesn't, um, like when he like when he explains socialism to Americans, which he does a lot, right? Because like this is an era where it's like a weird novelty, that like nobody's a socialist, in America in like the 80s, like that's a, like,
One could argue that nobody's a socialist in America either. So
yeah. Well, sure, but I mean, I think like nobody calls themselves that,
yeah.
in the 80s, or
No,
not.
that was success win Reaganism, baby. Let's go. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, no, exactly. Like, so they're like, even in like the 90s, there are these clips. Like, I mean, part of how like what sparked my interest in writing about him is that like on TMBS would do these, watch these like Hitchens like throwback clips, a few times, towards the end of TMBS existing, and some of them it's hilarious, right? Because like he'll be on C-SPAN, and like some woman will call in and be like, "I don't like this Hitchens. He seems like too much of a liberal," and Hitchens will be like,
Bro.
"Madame, you have insulted me more than you know." Uh,
That's awesome.
but
So that's become like in like amongst like the what left the America has people who's like self-defined as socialists, like they picked up that line almost exactly.
oh yeah, yeah. No,
Like
totally right. It was definitely ahead of his time on that. But yeah, like, but in some ways, right? Like even going like throughout the 80s, and even in the 90s, like he's still talking like, he's still talking like a pretty radical socialist in some ways, right? Like I think by then, I don't know how much he thought about these kinds of strategic questions. Probably not much, right? Because I think that's not really where he lived in terms of what he was writing and thinking about. But I think to the limited extent that it did, I mean, I think I think he probably believed in a sort of more gradual social democratic road to socialism. But
mhm,
like there's even like as far as what the horizon of that is, I think that, I don't like his views didn't seem to change that much, right? Like there's this debate that he did in 1997 It's a really weird debate. It's him and Jesse Jackson are debating, two guys from the National Review, about the death penalty, and Ed Koch is the moderator. But
Wild motley crew.
I know, right? But like in his opening statement of that debate, he's sort of casually says, the ultimate goal of my politics is a classless society. He quotes Ingalls on like how, without class divisions, they, instead of like a repressive state, we just have a neutral, administration of things. And so, and certainly like in 1986, this is also on YouTube. You can watch him and John Judas, who is still alive but is certainly not a socialist anymore, debating.
His name's Judas, so I mean,
Fair enough. With an ox. Yeah. So yeah, like, and they're debate and like they're debating these two like Ayn Rand Institute people on capitalism and socialism, and the sort of opening statement that Hitchens gives in that in many ways is like very like kind of orthodox Marxist. And so and and I should also say that even later, right, like when in some ways he substantially shifted to the right,
mhm.
he claims, and I mean, I think he's sincere. I just think he was confused. He claims to have still believed in the Marxist theory of history, right? Like he'll say things like the last years, he'll sort of half jokingly describe himself as a very conservative Marxist, by which I think he means like a somebody who doesn't really identify with socialism as an ongoing political project, but still thinks that like historical materialism is right. And but nevertheless, in by 2001, like pre 9/11, he wrote this book. Presumably, he would have been putting the finishing touches on in 2000 sometime, but whatever. It was published in 2000. It was published in like October 2001, called Letters to a Young Contrarian,
Mhm.
where he sort of says, like he writes with a lot of affection about socialist tradition, but he kind of says, look, it's not happening, right? Like at this stage of history, it's done, it's off the table.
Mhm.
And like
Which is that like, so when I think about this, this is like
uh,
2000. You said
uh,
2000, 2001.
yeah,
Is this like during the sort of prevailing, when the prevailing idea was sort of a end of history sort of thing, like the Fukuyama's?
totally.
So like that's definitely, at least, like that seems to, like, that would be a considerable influence on that line of thinking, I guess you could say.
Oh yeah, no question. I
Mhm,
think I think it's definitely a big influence on it. Like I think one of the most like kind of honest introspective things he says about it much later is he says, looking back on it, he thinks there's like probably, at some point in the years leading up to that, like he I think he kind of acknowledges that in retrospect he'd sort of gradually stopped taking it seriously as a historical possibility, but like he was kind of too stubborn to say that, right? Like he actually says, every time he went on C-SPAN, Brian Lamb would ask him in this kind of like condescending way, "Oh, are you still a socialist?" And like he said basically he didn't want Brian Lamb to win, so
You don't wanna
it's,
give it up, you don't wanna give it up, not necessarily because he didn't stop believing, but because he didn't wanna, like, it's kinda like the brother thing, like,
yeah.
you don't wanna take the L.
Yeah, exactly. So I think so I think in that kind of end of history atmosphere of the 90s, and of course there were, old radicals, your Noam Chomsky's and Alexander Coburns or whatever, who kind of stayed strong, but like also I will say that I think probably one difference is that Hitchens was in a much more like was swimming in much more mainstream waters, where I think it was probably harder to kind of like resist that sort of like just sort of sub-rational collective impression that like this is over, it's done, right? And
Which, by the way, is different than selling out for the money type sort of situation too. Like,
yeah,
you
yeah, yep, yeah. I think it's a lot different. I think that this is just like um Yeah, I mean, because I think what we're talking about now is not like, what he claimed to believe, it's like what he actually believed. Like, if anything, probably the insincere thing by his own admission is, like, claiming to be a socialist as long as he did, right? That, like, that he just, he just doesn't, doesn't want Brian Lamb to win. So, the
which is
I
awesome, by the way.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I respect that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. But, uh but I think that, like, once you kinda put together these 2 threads, I think you could start to see a little bit more of what happened, which I think is pretty much this, that, like, this is a guy who spends a lot of his life as this kinda globe-trotting journalist. He goes to places like Iraq, and, various countries living under repressive dictatorships. In fact, a really important element, I think, of this progression is that after he was opposed to the first Gulf War, but, like, after the Gulf War, he spent some time in, like, Iraqi Kurdistan, and uh, and he's influenced by Kurdish leaders who, for obvious reasons, were pro-intervention, and as like Jean Bajalan, who's a Kurdish, well, Kurdish British academic in America, however you say that, as,
He's got a bunch of boxes ticked in a lot
yeah,
of ways.
yeah, 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 exactly. So,
A lot of
yeah,
not to minimize it, by the way, a lot of perspectives that he could see things from it.
yeah, 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 sure, sure,
To
sure.
make it a little bit less sort of dismissive, I guess you could say, 'cause
Yeah, no, but
he's a
he's
great thinker and a great and a luminary in a lot of ways.
yeah, no, for sure. I mean, Gene's great, but yeah, but it's somebody from like a Kurdish background in Britain,
Yeah,
right? He has, and who also actually lived in Iraq for a while. So like a point that Gene made to me when we were talking about this is that, like, some of these, like, kind of like leaders in this Kurdish enclave in northern Iraq were people who had been 70s radicals themselves, and they could kind of speak to Hitchens in his own language.
yeah,
Um, and so I think that was definitely part of it. But I think, like, zooming out a little bit, like, to the bigger picture, I think that in his kind of career as this globetrotting journalist, he had spent all this time, with, like, he would get to know dissidents and, various, authoritarian countries or whatever. And even presumably for most of his career, on some level, he's still holding on to the assumption that at some point in the future, all of these regimes were going to be, swept away by, like, a, future wave of, socialist revolutions, right? I mean, like that, I'm sure that's what he thought, at least originally. And so I think when he's given up on that, he still wants at least, like, democratic revolutions to happen in these places, at the very least. And so far I can, like, sympathize with the whole chain of reasoning, but I think where it goes off a cliff is at thinking that, like, the 82nd Airborne, can be like the vehicle for, like, spreading democratic revolution in these societies, which is fucking insane. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, but I think that it's something that you can convince yourself of if you've given up hope in anything else.
yeah.
And, like, you want to maintain some kind of hope for something, and, you end up, like, kind of, convincing yourself of something that doesn't really make sense. I think that this is like kind of the same way, like, we're talking about this in the book, like, like, there are lots of people who I admire very much, who, like, in, like, the 30s and 40s, convinced themselves that, like, like, talked themselves into, being apologists for Stalin, not because they were terrible people, but just because, like, that seemed like um, the sort of beacon of hope, for a different world that existed then.
Literally, what else is there, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, totally, right? Like, so I think that's what, I think that's what happened politically. And I should say, so, like I said, there are kind of 3 reasons that I wrote it. And so, like, one of them is just sort of like, is to sort of, like, reintroduce people to that earlier body of work. Another one is try to, like, explore a way that might be more plausible and convincing than, like, other accounts that I've seen from the left, like, what exactly happened to the guy.
mhm,
Because, like when the book came out last month, that's the 10-year anniversary of his death. So I figured
Yeah.
this is like a time when people might be interested, and also when maybe enough time has passed for like the sort of initial sting of that heel turn to have like faded enough that we could like look at it a little bit more dispassionately.
Right.
And then the third thing is like really the most self-indulgent one, which is just like, he's somebody I always found really compelling, and I wanted to kind of like sort of work out some of those mixed feelings and like think and like and like think a little bit more about like what he was right and wrong about, and like because he's somebody like way the hell back, in like the late '90s, right? Like I can remember reading Hitchens's some of his like Minority Report columns in the Nation, and I always thought he was a really interesting writer.
Mhm.
And like in the late 2000s, I was never exactly a new atheist, but like I saw, but like I remember, like seeing some of that stuff on YouTube and thinking it was really good, and I think that I think even now, right, whatever criticisms I have of like certain aspects of his his kind of career as an atheist, or certainly of his of some of his friends from that period who have not exactly distinguished themselves in the years since. I think that I I mean, this is not a very cool thing to admit, as a leftist in 2022, but I kind of do still find the issue interesting, and
The issue of atheism, you mean?
yeah, yeah, and I do find some of the kind of like humanistic moral critique of Christianity that he was making in those years. Like that there are aspects of it that I still find pretty compelling. Honestly,
Mhm.
that like that there's a so some of that stuff still strikes a chord with me. So I mean, like that's I think for all those which like I don't know, like it sort of seems like a lot of people now like on the left have this kind of like too cool for school attitude about the whole thing. Like it's like, oh yeah, no, that's like boring, right? Like who cares about that, right? Like whether there's a God or whether you stop existing when you die, or like what the foundations of morality are, that's all,
Doesn't
whatever,
matter.
you
Doesn't
know,
matter.
yeah,
No,
these are all lame preoccupations, but like, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just I'm a philosophy nerd, but also like I have to say, I mean, and look, I'll also admit, I said earlier, this is kind of the self-indulgent part, because like probably more than any other book that I've ever written, like this is sort of me kind of like working out some of my own preoccupations, but like I think I don't know. I mean, I wrote it at a time when between the global pandemic and Michael dying and some of the people I know have died, like I mean, kind of human mortality has been like on my mind a lot in the last year and a half or so. And so maybe like that makes revisiting some of these debates like kind of especially like vivid and interesting to me. Like I actually that does seem like a pretty like emotionally gripping thing to me. Like that whole sort of like, is that it? Does anything happen to you when you die? All that stuff.
yeah. I think there's a distinction to be made specifically, um, when it comes to, like, the questions of, like, atheism and things like that, and, like, distinguishing between them as, like, political questions or, like, stuff you're, like, interested in and, like, actually, like, want to know the answer for, and, like,
Uh-huh.
those 2 things are not completely, like the Venn diagram is not totally 2 separate circles, but, like, I don't know. Like the fact that you want to have a discussion or you're interested in the topic or the subject of like atheism going forward, like that's part and I think it's like I think that it's like not in fashion to sort of discuss these things in the same way because there was such a weird like
Yeah, yeah,
towards like atheism equals virtue or something like that or
yeah, yeah,
atheism
yeah.
equals like sober thinking or something like that and like that is what reason has been sort of like all wrapped up in which like I don't think you would even argue that that's the case necessarily
Sure. Yeah,
but like
definitely not.
also that doesn't necessarily mean that when you come back which is I think where we're at now, and it's sort of like a backlash and like looking at a lot of these like cringe people like Sargon or Akkad from the internet or whatever, like on YouTube. Like you don't want to
Uh,
like go back and just say like,
uh,
oh, well, atheism or whatever is the absence of reason because we've come so far from that as well. Like these are still like interesting questions. The sort of like super like the sort of like phenomenological sort of things, right? And they're interesting to talk about whether or not they're connected to politics, I guess you could say.
no, I think that's exactly right. Like I think that I think part of what happened is that there was this moment in the late 2000s, kind of going into the early 2010s, like
Which
very
arguably Hitchens was a part of,
oh, totally,
like
totally, yeah.
and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and a bunch of people, like a bunch of just random like neckbeards on the internet, like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, yeah, and like Hitchens was a huge part of this, and like in some ways, in fact, part of what makes him interesting to me on this topic is that I think he was both kind of the smartest and most compelling of
yeah,
those guys, right?
he
But
would have had a lot of contempt for some of these people,
yeah,
I
yeah.
would imagine.
Yeah, no, I think so. But like, so like he was definitely like, out of those guys you just listed, I mean, he was definitely the best one, but also like I also there's no denying that I mean he had like, like, not his worst legacy, right? But like a also not a good one, right? That he did bear a lot of responsibility for like what was wrong,
Yeah.
with that sort of version of like an atheist, movement. And
Stylistically, by the way, too, like the
uh,
fact that he would just like epically own somebody
yeah.
like a debate on national television or whatever, like became like a lot of internet culture that exists now too.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, actually, I think those like, hitch slap videos. I mean, in some ways, those were like the primordial, like, like the like,
Christopher Hitchens eviscerates.
yeah, 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 totally. And it's like, I mean, it's funny, right? Because it's like, man, in 2022, um, like every YouTube video is like that, right? Like
Oh
that's,
yeah,
um, I mean, I always kind of, whatever. I mean, like it's you have to. Um, like if well, like if you want to swim in that space, you have to make some awkward compromises with that. Like I always tell people like our at GTAA, our YouTube manager Kelly, that like those like whatever the Ben Burgess, Nana Kasparian, destroy, whatever the fuck, like, that's like, yeah, I would never be able to bring myself to write those titles. That's why what I pay Kelly for.
yeah. I'm not creative enough to do that. Like this is why our YouTube game sucks so bad because like I'm the person that's making the thumbnails and like titling the videos or whatever, and I'm just sort of like Jeff talks to Ben Burgess about these things, and that's just I don't know. I don't have the brain for that kind of stuff. You know what I
Yeah, I
mean?
mean, I also just feel a little gross about it
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's like I kind of hate I kind of hate that that's where the culture is at, but like also like what are you gonna do?
You
Uh,
gotta eat.
Yeah, 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 like, and, you gotta eat, and also you wanna, like, presumably, I mean, if you're doing this, you have something to say and you want people to hear it, right? So you
Right.
sorta there's an extent to which you kinda have to, preach to the Gentiles in their own tongue.
Yeah.
So it's tricky. But yeah, he is definitely, like, yeah, he was, like, one of the first. I mean, he was, like, really maybe the first, like, big, like, YouTube debate star, right?
Godfather of it. He's a godfather of it. It's what
Yeah,
it is.
yeah. Yeah, totally, right? I mean, like, that like, and especially because like, almost all of his debates were, like, in person, but what really, like, sort of blew up the phenomenon, was everybody watching it on YouTube and, sort of putting together the compilations and, all of
The debate bros are his fault. Let's put that on him.
yeah, 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 right, so exactly. So, so yeah, yeah, for sure, right? And I think part of so I think part of why there was that kind of space for like why why the sort of debate bros are sort of originally coalescing around somebody like Christopher Hitchens is that I think there was this moment in the late 2000s, then going into the early 2010s, when it kind of like the American culture war was much more directly and obviously about religion than it is now.
Yeah.
Like the American right was just totally identified with like this particular kind of like, really evangelical Protestantism kind of like allied to right wing Catholics, right? That was the, like there was and like at the top levels just evangelical Protestantism, but like they knew, like they knew where to
It was it was the kind of a situation where Rick Santorum could become a senator and a presidential candidate.
Yeah, yeah, totally, right? That's the like, yeah, right. I mean, Rick Santorum is very
An embarrassment to Catholics, by the way.
yeah, yeah.
I'm throwing it out there.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I mean, I know, but like he's like a representative of a very recognizable
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of Catholic right winger from that, like even like the sweater vest and all that stuff, like that's a type, but
It's like a waspy, almost like a it really weird sounds weird because it's like a New England Protestant Catholic
yeah,
almost.
yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's a contradiction in terms, but it's like a there's a cohesion in aesthetics, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, for sure, right? Like, and there was like, I don't know. I mean, I remember like in 2004, there'd be, um, like Catholic churches in my home state of Michigan who'd have like they'd have like like for people leaving the church, there'd be like a little table where you could sign the petition to get the redundant anti-gay marriage thing onto the ballot to, which was like, the whole point of that was just to turn out, like it wasn't like gay marriage was about to be legal in Michigan if they hadn't done that, right? I mean, the point was, the point was to turn out, voters to reelect Bush and Cheney in 2004. So
Right.
so there
Get
was
people
doubt.
registered, yeah.
Yes, there was
I mean,
definitely.
that's their machine. That was their machine.
Yeah, yeah.
Still is in a lot of ways, and still really is.
No, I think it still is, but like it's a weird. Like I said, it's not as direct and obvious now. Like even though the evangelicals are still the um, definitely the most reliable kind of electoral shock troops, for the Republican Party.
Mhm.
Um, they're not like kind of front and center visible the way they used to be.
Yeah,
Like,
small business owners have definitely, like, taken up a lot of
yeah,
the vanguard position, you know what I mean?
yeah, totally. Like and again, the culture war has just changed in some like really bizarre ways. Like the fact that like all of those guys, like all of these kind of like intense moral majority types, like lost their shit over Monica Lewinsky, but like Donald Trump could like have like there could be like a paper trail of like of hush money, that he paid to a porn star, and it's like, yeah, whatever, it's like, it's next subject, right? Move on. And
Starting to think that they don't actually care about these kinds of things, but
yeah, well, there is definitely that, but like also, I don't know. Sometimes I get the impression that like Donald Trump could like do a speech in front of an upside down cross where he like splash blood on it during the speech, and as long as he owned the libs in the
right,
speech, like everybody would be fine with it. Like it's got it.
I mean, I've watched enough Trump rallies. I could see him, like, doing that if, like, he thought it would get him, like, the slightest bit of like, that's it's actually kind of incredible. Like, if you ever watch like, I don't know if you ever, like, sit through, like, if you have to like, sit through, like, a Trump rally, he literally just kinda, like, comes out and says, like, whatever the hell he wants to say just because he wants the hogs to cheer. It's awesome. It's great.
No, yeah, I know. It's
It's
like this.
awesome.
Yeah, just the fact that that guy, just that like like just the rambling stream of consciousness, like it's like some like netherworld between like stand-up comedy and I don't even know what, right? But like it's a like the Trump rally speech is almost like like a form of writing that's, I mean, not that any of it's written down, but it's like it's its own form, you know, like that's it's
It is literally politics as a vibe, is what it
yes. No, exactly. Yes. Like, so it's like whatever. I mean, he could be talking about anything, you know.
is.
It's like, oh yeah, the toilets, you know, you have to flush them more, you know, than
Yeah,
you used to. Has everybody ever noticed that? You know, and they like and yeah, no, I remember like, you know, going to this Vanity Fair party in 1996. It was very nice, but you know, they have
yeah,
like
well, anyway, so the book is Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters by Ben Burgis. Thank you so much for once again enduring all of my bullshit on the radio. It's always great to talk to you, Ben.
yes.
We gotta hang again. We gotta hang out when you come down here, get
Yeah,
some,
for sure.
and we'll have a great time. But
Yeah.
thank you so much, dude. Like seriously, as always, we'll keep in touch. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, brother.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and log off.